once this fighting somehow concludes one way or another, we'll still have a very aggressive Russia, quite capable of this kind of cruelty. Whether Putin is in the Kremlin or not, whoever may follow him could also be someone that doesn't hesitate to apply such cruel measures. So, for the West, for NATO, for the UK and the US, what do we do?
Ukraine's First Lady, Olena Zelenska, has addressed the British Parliament and urged MPs to unite the world community to help end Russia's bombardment of her country. NATO's Secretary General has said President Putin is using the winter as a weapon of war. In a moment, I'll be joined by Jim Townsend, former US Deputy Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO. And later this hour, we'll hear from the Ukrainian MP, Vladimir Ariev. The Chinese ambassador to the UK has been summoned to the Foreign Office as the government demands an explanation of the arrest of a BBC journalist in Shanghai, and the Chinese authorities threaten a further crackdown on protests. I've been talking to the author and former BBC correspondent Humphrey Hawksley. And less than half of the population of England and Wales identifies as Christian. We'll discuss what it means for the church and for wider society. Ukraine's First Lady, Olena Zelenska, addressed the British Parliament today and called on the world community to unite to achieve justice for Ukraine. Mrs. Zelenska is visiting the UK to highlight the plight of the Ukrainian people, millions of whom face a harsh winter with frequent power cuts caused by Russian attacks on the country's energy infrastructure. She showed pictures of the effects of the strikes and compared Russia's bombardment of Ukrainian cities to Nazi Germany's bombing of the UK during World War II.
We need to unite the world community, just as it happened in January 1942, to support the special tribunal against the aggression of Russia against Ukraine. I'm asking you a small favor to become the world leader in the justice efforts. This justice is not just needed for Ukraine. We need it so that the world could lead its life not by the rule of force, as the aggressor wants, but following the values of humanism. We need the justice so that the world could survive.
Well, meanwhile, NATO foreign ministers meeting in Bucharest have vowed to support Ukraine for as long as it takes and said the country's future membership of the alliance remains on the table. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg accused President Putin of using the winter as a weapon of war.
President Putin is trying to weaponize winter, to force Ukrainians to freeze or flee. He is trying to break the will of the brave Ukrainian people and to divide all of us who support them. But our meeting here in Bucharest is sending a strong message of NATO unity and of sustained support for Ukraine. NATO is not a party to the war, but we will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. We will not back down.
Well, that was Jens Stoltenberg speaking earlier today. Let's talk now to Jim Townsend, who's a former US Deputy Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO under Presidents Obama and Biden. Good evening to you, Jim.
Well, good evening to you.
Good to have you with us. An important statement there from Jens Stoltenberg saying that NATO would continue to support Ukraine. What do you think that support should look like, though?
Well, I think this winter, I'm beginning to call it the battle of the generators, in the sense that you're beginning to see, both in the U.S. and also European nations, including UK, I think, sending generators to Ukraine to help them through this winter war with Russia. So I think we're going to see over time a dark Ukraine, a cold Ukraine, a humanitarian catastrophe in some ways for the elderly and the very young in a very cold Ukraine, and the West trying to figure out how can we best help. I mean, generators are fine, but you're going to have to send a lot of them. We're going to send more air defense, I hope, because it's the missiles coming down on the electrical capability that's causing these problems. So I think our assistance is going to go from just ammunition and weapons of war to include generators and maybe even blankets.
Yeah, because Jens Stoltenberg there talking about how President Putin is using the winter as a weapon of war. And, the temperature is dropping. We've heard of people in many towns and cities who are suffering power cuts, sometimes lasting as long as 36 hours. I was talking to somebody on the program a couple of nights ago, was talking about that. And those conditions are very, very difficult. It is an attempt, isn't it, to try to break the will of the Ukrainian people.
It is, and it's very cruel. And I will say too that Putin wants very much for Europe, if not the United States, but particularly Europe to feel the cold as well. Europe has energy crisis going on. The price of energy, both in Europe and also in the UK, I know, are going higher. U.S. too. And so, if he can spread some of this cruelty into the West, that's great. Anything he can do to try to split us up, to try to put pressure on the Western governments not to support Ukraine, that's what he wants to do. Because at the end of the day, he knows that if the West stops supporting the fighters in Ukraine, his forces will have the upper hand. And so he wants to split us up.
And we've seen President Putin, haven't we, resorting to different tactics during different phases of this war. Originally, there was this invasion. He clearly expected it to be far easier than it was. We've then seen the surrounding and bombardment of some key cities. Some of those places like Kherson have now been recaptured, and he's now resorting to this bombardment of the energy infrastructure, which is inflicting its own pain on the Ukrainian people.
It's very cruel. I just, it's something we thought we would never see again in the continent of Europe. We worked so hard after World War II, putting in institutions to keep this kind of activity and this kind of tyrant, to keep them at bay and away from the modern world. And here we're seeing it right now. And I think for the West, not only do we have to support Ukraine and the people of Ukraine during this winter, but we have to figure out too, what will we do with a Russia like this that is reaching back into the last century for tactics and for approaches that are bringing such cruelty to civilians? We've got to figure this out. This war is going to be going on not just once the fighting stops on the battleground, but afterwards too, as we figure out what do we do with a Russia like this.
So, in the short term, you're saying the response should be more weapons, more air defences, and more generators to help the Ukrainians literally survive in the coming months. But then, what a rethink of how we approach Russia? I mean, we have already imposed sanctions, haven't we?
We've put sanctions on them. There'll be more to follow. I'm sure we'll see more cruelty from Putin. But I'm thinking also in the long term, with once the somehow this fighting somehow concludes one way or another, we'll still have a very aggressive Russia, quite capable of this kind of cruelty. Whether Putin is in the Kremlin or not, whoever may follow him could also be someone that doesn't hesitate to apply such cruel measures. So for the West, for NATO, for the UK and the US, what do we do with a Russia like that on the continent? How do we live our lives now, surrounding and putting him into a box? So we have to think long term as well.
Yeah, we've had Ukraine's First Lady, Elena Zelenska, here in the UK. She spoke to the British Parliament today, called on the world community to unite to achieve justice for Ukraine. And that continued Western support is absolutely crucial, isn't it? Do you think that it is solid? Is the United States going to be able to maintain the levels of support which it has been providing, given the setbacks in terms of the midterm elections?
Well, that's a great question, and we're all holding our breath right now as the new government will take its seats early next year. The right now the reading is that in the House, which will be controlled by the Republicans, they're going to make it very hard for the Democratic administration and for Joe Biden. They're going to make it hard for him to provide assistance to Ukraine because that we have a presidential election coming up in 2 years, and this is what Republicans are going to do is to politicize this assistance, and they're going to have investigations and make sure that we are providing the right kind of assistance, et cetera. I don't think they're going to stop the assistance. It might delay the assistance as they go through these political machinations. But right now we're hoping that the assistance will continue, but it might be at a slower rate.
And do you think that this latest tactic of President Putin's could lead to a further exodus from Ukraine? At the beginning of the invasion, we saw hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians leaving the country. If you've got a situation where we know that many of the medical facilities are really struggling with the lack of power and so on, as you mentioned, the young, the old, the vulnerable are really at risk if there is no power and the temperatures are dipping down below freezing point. Do you think that we could see a further wave of people feeling that they simply can't stay on in Ukraine?
Yes, I really do think we will. I think we'll see refugees who are fleeing the cold. They're fleeing the darkness. They're fleeing the inability to cook food because there's no electricity for their stoves. There's a lot of things that could happen as we get into the winter that will cause refugees to leave, and it might be that kind of thing is the best because I find it hard to figure out how we're going to send so much humanitarian assistance to Ukraine to help them through the winter. And so part of the solution might be for those most vulnerable to leave Ukraine and to try to have sanctuary outside until springtime comes and they can go home. That might be part of the answer is to try to get the most vulnerable out of a very dark and cold Ukraine.
Jim Townsend, former US Deputy Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO.